Does the Shroud of Turin have this? Like, God, Almighty God, where's the date on the Shroud of Turin? Because people can't seem to get that right. So if this is your actual receipt, could you, I don't know, put a date on it? Also, why would you let your literal receipt of salvation be nearly destroyed in a fire, in water, and by centuries of exposure? Why would you allow that if this was your literal receipt of salvation? Why would you let your literal receipt of salvation be used to bring in money for a church when that is something that Jesus literally flipped tables over? Like, I have so many questions. Welcome to the Common Sense Cult, where we unravel Christian thinking, criticize indoctrination, and dissect apologetics. Today we're going to do a bit of all three as we dissect the renowned Shroud of Turin. Now, I had the chance to hear the Shroud of Turin expert speak on the matter, and I'm going to share audio from that presentation. It's not going to be the full thing because we'd be here forever, but I will link the transcript in the description below if you are so inclined to read it. But it was free and open to the public, so I recorded the audio and I'm going to share it with you guys. The presenter was Russ Breault. I'm sorry if I'm mispronouncing his name, but he is the founder of The Shroud Encounter and is an author, speaker, educator, and international expert. He has appeared on the History Channel, CBS, ABC News, etc. He is apparently a very big name when it comes to the Shroud of Turin. Like, when I say the expert on the matter, I'm talking about the absolute expert on the matter. I now realize, after listening to his presentation, that that is probably a self-proclaimed title. He's not actually an expert on the Shroud, besides using it to push a specific narrative about Christianity and Christian beliefs. Oh, look, his own mission statement is about indoctrinating children. Oops, sorry. That says to advance the knowledge of the Shroud to a new generation. Same thing. To give you an idea of what the presentation was like, because I'm going to share some of the visuals, but not all the ones that he had. But I want to show you this very outdated clip teaser of what people actually pay him to present.
Could an ancient Jewish linen cloth be the actual burial shroud of Jesus? Could the Shroud of Turin be a document of the crucifixion? Is that even possible? Or is it nothing more than a medieval hoax? For hundreds of years, this ancient linen cloth, etched with the faint image of a crucified man, has mystified millions. It continues to speak from centuries past, challenging us to unlock its many secrets. Nearly every scientific regimen has been employed to unravel the mystery, and yet it remains unsolved. Shroud Encounter is a dramatic big-screen experience. Each clue is revealed and examined like a CSI investigation, leading deeper into its maze of mystery and intrigue. Explore this profound enigma with Russ Breault, one of the world's leading experts, captivating audiences from coast to coast and featured in numerous documentaries seen on History Channel, Discovery, and CBS. Don't miss Shroud Encounter.
Anyways, I went into this presentation expecting some very top-notch research and unbiased analysis. I mean, if you're going to call yourself an expert on something, I do expect unbiased analysis and critique.
But I got to tell you, folks, we got a problem.
Oh no.
And that problem is called carbon dating. And again, in 1988, they carbon dated the shroud with, and they said they sent a little sample off to 3 different labs, and they said it had a date range of 1260 to 1390. So I guess that's the end of this lecture.
Yes, actually, we should have started with this, and then we could have ended in about 2 minutes. There you go. Case closed. It was made in the medieval times.
They were supposed to cut at least 3 different samples from 3 different locations on the cloth. They didn't do that. So what did they do? I'm going to give you this is a general area of where they cut for carbon dating right in here. In fact, we know that the shroud was physically, manually held up exactly as you see here over 275 times from 1418 to 1694.
So I'm going to summarize what Russ was saying here because he was largely depending on images on the screen, but he essentially was showing pictures of the coroner where they cut the sample from to do the carbon dating, and he was showing that in paintings, lots of people were grabbing on the corners to hold it up and display it.
If you were looking for the worst possible sample location, you would pick from one of those two outside corners, which of course is what they did.
And again, with this, he's downplaying the fact that the whole entire shroud has been contaminated by fire, by water, by people. The whole thing has been handled. You're not just going to say one corner is contaminated because paintings show that it was like that. So now we're, again, saying paintings are going to be accurate. I feel like that's a bit ironic. But the whole thing has been contaminating. They didn't just touch the corners, you know? Huge portions in the middle have water stains, fire damage. The whole thing has been contaminated. And to even stretch it out and hang it like this, you would have to touch it. You have to handle it. You have to touch the middle. And I'm sure people have touched the face of Jesus, touched his body to venerate it. I mean, come on. It's not just that one corner that has been handled by people. And he's also downplaying the fact that it was sent to 3 labs. I don't know if you caught that. He did say it, but it was sent to 3 different labs. And all of them came back with the same dating, which was specifically from 1260 to 1390.
So now, with taking one sample instead of 3, we see now 5th graders know that cutting one sample into 3 pieces is not the same as taking 3 different samples.
Well, this is condescending and rude while also misrepresenting the goal of the 3 samples in carbon dating. And that goal is to have 3 separate analyses. And that's why they send it to 3 separate labs. It would be ideal to take the samples from 3 different places on the shroud. Yeah, that would have been better. But the bigger issue is to send it to 3 different places to have it tested. So in case one place it didn't come out fully accurate or there was some error in the testing, you still have 2 other locations to compare it to. So you have 3 different datings, and then you can make a conclusion based on that. So yes, while they took one sample and cut it into 3 different pieces, it doesn't negate the fact that there were still 3 separate carbon datings. And I just have to point out that he is telling people to disregard the carbon dating because of a painting from somebody who has just shit on artists of that time for the past 45 minutes. Now we're going to take art seriously, and if a painting shows that a hand was on that corner, well, then that must be absolute truth. But this could never be a real thing from an artist because artists couldn't do that back then. But these artists are depicting the absolute truth, and they are completely representing what happened accurately. It's very ironic to me, you know?
And so now enter Ray Rogers, thermal chemist with the Los Alamos National Laboratory. He begins to suspect that there's something awry with that corner because there's some spectrographic data that was saying that there's something chemically different with it. So he obtains a thread sample from the main body of the shroud and compares it with a thread sample from the middle of the reserve sample. Remember, the sample was cut but not carbon dated, and he publishes in a peer-reviewed journal and says, "Oh, lo and behold, they're not the same."
I don't know if you heard that, but he said, remember, the sample is cut but not carbon dated. So he's just glossing over the fact that Ray Roger worked on loose threads, not the actual samples that were carbon dated. And then he's saying that the samples that were carbon dated were different from the actual shroud, even though he was not testing on the samples that were carbon dated. Are you following that?
But for some reason, there's cotton in that corner. And lastly, he finds the presence of starch to stiffen the threads to effect some kind of repair. So in other words, we have all the ingredients for some kind of a medieval reweave or some kind of a medieval repair.
Now, here's where a textile historian would have helped greatly and would have thrown this idea out the window right away. There are no confirmed large-scale medieval reweaving practices, let alone one that could trick 3 different carbon dating laboratories. I mean, that assumption that he's planting in people's brains is just so out there, so unsupported by what historians actually have for the medieval times. It's just, well, I have to make this work somehow, so we're just going to say that reweaving happened on a large scale, and that's what they did in the Shroud of Turin. That's what happened, when there's no evidence to back that. He's just jumping to conclusions with no evidence. And again, taking advantage of the fact that the people listening to him aren't going to go and look into the history behind textiles in medieval times. And also, the trace cotton that he found is not a sign of a full fabric replacement. Even if there was a repair that was done, it doesn't erase the bulk linen structure that was carbon dated. Because what he's trying to say is that in medieval times, they repaired the shroud and they did a reweave. So that's why they're getting dates from medieval times. But even if there was a repair, it wouldn't have been replacing the bulk of the shroud, which was what was carbon dated. They didn't carbon date the one singular cotton here that he's saying that was supposedly a reweave. They carbon dated the bulk of the fabric, and that dated to the 1300s. This is just a whole lot of purposeful misrepresentation of the tests that were done, a misunderstanding of textiles and textile history, and an invention of plausible solutions like massive reweaving during the medieval times that history doesn't support. And it's all done to somehow make the Shroud of Turin seem legit.
So now enter a new technology called wide-angle X-ray scattering. This was published in 2022, peer-reviewed journal.
Finally getting to the good stuff. I feel like this test in 2022 was what really brought the Shroud of Turin back into popularity and really convinced people again that this is the real Shroud of Jesus, because I don't really remember this being a topic when I was a Christian at all. So I think this more recent test is what really pushed it again on social media, on YouTube and everything.
And they determined this technique measures the amount of natural aging found in various types of fibers, and by analyzing the amount of natural aging, they can determine, based on comparison with other fabrics, how old the shroud is. And what we found is that there's far more aging in fibers from the shroud for it to be only to be 700 years old. In fact, the best sample that they found that best compares with the natural aging found with the shroud, that linen sample was excavated from Masada, Israel, circa first century.
First century. Now it's miraculously being dated to the 1st century. So this test that was done in 2022, it measures the natural aging of linen cellulose by analyzing how the crystalline structures break down over time. It was done specifically to try and prove that the carbon dating test done in 1988 was inaccurate. However, in possibly one of the most ironic twists, the test that they did in 2022 can only be accurate in perfect preservation conditions. And the people who did this test admitted it themselves. Here's a quote from the article that they published. The experimental results are compatible with the hypothesis that the Shroud of Turin is a 2,000-year-old relic as supposed by Christian tradition, under the condition that it was kept at suitable levels of average secular temperature, 20 to 22.5 degrees Celsius, and correlated relative humidity, 75 to 55%, for 13 centuries of unknown history, in addition to the 7 centuries of known history in Europe, to make the present result compatible with that of the 1988 radiocarbon test. The Shroud of Turin should have been conserved during its hypothetical 7 centuries of life at a secular room temperature very close to the maximum values registered on the Earth. Now, was the Shroud of Turin kept in a temperature-controlled area for 13 centuries? Of course not. It wasn't even kept in temperature-controlled conditions in the last 7 centuries that we know of, because it was in a fucking fire. Of course, it's going to say an older date because things like fire can cause more rapid deconstruction. This is basic logic. I mean, I don't know how they can even use this test to say it dates the 1st century when it has been through a fire, extreme heat, and chemical reactions and things that would make something decompose. Of course it's dating older, of course. And Russ knows just how poorly kept the shroud was. Even in the 7 centuries that we know of its history, it was taken out all the time. It was displayed all the time. 4 centuries. It has never been perfectly conserved. And we're going to look into this in a couple minutes. He's going to talk about this, the supposed history before the 1300s, when we have documented history of when it was and where it was and how many people handled it. He's going to talk about what he thinks happened to it beforehand, and he's going to explain how it traveled. People stole it. It was taken places. People touched it. It was never perfectly conserved, not for the 700 years that we have of it documented, nor the alleged 1300 years before that. There's no way that this is perfectly conserved. There's no way that this test is accurate. Russ cannot be so stupid as to complain about the contamination of the shroud and where they took the sample because that area was contaminated, only to turn around and use a type of dating that depends on zero contamination to try and prove that this is the legit Shroud of Jesus. But here we are, confirmation bias at its best.
So now we're going to have to look a little bit more at the historical trail.
This is what I was talking about.
So what evidence is there to prove that the shroud existed prior to the alleged garden date? But before we do, I'm going to tell you about the story about the legend of King Abgar.
We are going to talk about a legend. A legend when exploring the historical trail of an artifact. A legend. And yes, this story is considered a legend by historians about King Abgar and Jesus. So apparently legends are fact now. I mean, if you're going to believe in the resurrection, why not believe in this legend too? Yeah.
So he sends a messenger down to Jerusalem to find Jesus and ask if he could come back to Edessa and bring healing to him. And Jesus, no doubt, says, well, listen, I'd love to help, but I'm a little busy right now. And so he commits to send one of his followers later on, which ended up being the apostle Jude, that is. And it's, and so Jude brings a cloth with a mysterious image on it back to Edessa. And Abgar is healed of leprosy. He becomes a believer, and so Jude stays there at Edessa for many years apparently, and evangelizes. But now, if anytime you see an icon image of Saint Jude, you'll see with a face image of Jesus on his chest, most likely. And this has to do with this Edessan story that occurred. And so this cloth with this mysterious image on it, it becomes known as the image of Edessa. And it is described as the true likeness of Christ, not made by human hands.
Can you tell what he's getting at here by bringing up this image of Edessa? He's going to say that was the Shroud of Turin. Yup. He's going to say they're one and the same, based on a fucking legend. A legend.
By 944, Edessa had fallen to Islam, and the emperor Constantinople was concerned about the safety and the well-being of this most holy of all Christian relics, the true likeness.
He's explaining this painting here, by the way, in his presentation. And like I said with the painting where they're grabbing on the corners of the shroud, it's very ironic that he is basing his analysis of the historical trail on artwork while also trying to debunk artwork. So he's valuing some as truth and accurate depictions of what happened, while also downplaying artists of the time and saying that they were too shit at their job to produce something like the Shroud of Turin. Ironic.
So here's the big church in the background, the Hagia Sophia. Here is the general of the army. Here's the army. Here's the emperor. In between the general and the emperor is this third face image. And it's telling us that there's an image on this cloth. But wait a bit. This is not some small cloth. It's draped over the emperor's arm several times, all the way over the general's back. So it's a long linen cloth with the face at the center of it. Kind of what we see on the shroud.
And what is he using as proof? A painting, and a painting from an artist who clearly does not understand perception and size and distance and everything. And so in this painting, which is not accurate, we're going to take the part that the cloth is long and say that that's the Shroud of Turin. And if we use that logic, then the face that they painted, off the cloth is also literally a 3D image of Jesus on the cloth. I mean, like, this doesn't make any sense to me. We are just selectively applying logic here. We're going to completely ignore all the other traditions about the image of Edessa that say only face, only face, only face. It's the face of Jesus. It's a small cloth about this size. It's the face of Jesus. We're going to ignore all of those traditions to claim that the image of Edessa was actually a 14-foot long shroud because of this one painting that can't get perception and death correct. Right. Yeah, that makes sense. And this is all being done to retroactively fit the Shroud of Turin into pre-medieval history. Great historical work, Russ. Good job.
And from this point on, from the rediscovery of this cloth in the early 6th century, all of your icon images of Jesus change.
So he backtracked a bit here. He started talking about early images of Jesus and how they were very different from what the image of Jesus is on the image of Edessa and also the Shroud of Turin, because, I mean, he thinks they're the same thing. And yes, the image of Jesus is similar in both of them. But he was comparing both of these images of Jesus, saying the earlier ones looked a certain way, and then the later ones after the image of Edessa came out looked a certain way. And he was using that to somehow prove that the Shroud of Turin was more accurate and that these early depictions were inaccurate. And that's kind of opposite of how historical analysis works. And I mean, I sat there scratching my head listening to this because it makes zero sense. Because the closer the artists were to Jesus' times, I would think the more accurate their depictions would have been. Not the other way around, that when things like the image of Edessa and everything made it to Europe and Christianity was really popular in Europe and they reinvented the image of Jesus. And now he's saying that Jesus, the medieval Jesus, the European Jesus, is the actual image of Jesus? I was at a loss of words, to be honest. And I mean, just from a very brief art history standpoint, the style of the Jesus in the Shroud of Turin and the image of Edessa and, all throughout the Middle Ages, yes, it looks very similar because they're using iconography to represent a cultural standardization of Jesus' appearance. The image of Jesus became standardized. That's what this is showing. It's not showing that the image used in medieval times and throughout Europe is the real likeness of Jesus. It just means that it became standardized and they're using iconography.
Because now the true likeness has been
True
revealed.
likeness.
And if you're an icon painter, you're not going to paint a picture of Jesus any way dissimilar to what has now become known as the true likeness. In fact, you're familiar with these. These images are all through the Orthodox. You go into a Greek Orthodox church or even an Eastern Rite Catholic church, and you see these kind of icon images of Jesus.
Again, I have to say this is just such a ridiculous argument to me. Byzantine art showed a cultural standardization, not a real likeness. In fact, these images of Jesus that he's showing, the one on the shroud and the one on the image of Edessa, they look so much like a white medieval man from Europe. The facial structure, the nose, everything. Put it next to other medieval renderings and you'll see. And if you look at the image of Jesus, it specifically has features that reflected holiness in that time. Like long hair, larger eyes, elongated faces, the long nose. All of these were symbols of holiness. It doesn't mean that it was the actual true likeness of Jesus. Even if they said it was during that time, any art historian could have told you that, no, this was iconography. They used these different ways of drawing the eyes, the face, to show holiness. This is what the artist did. It's not that the artist wanted to paint the true likeness because it was a little literal face of Jesus, but that's what became standardized. And again, Russ, you really could have benefited from an art history lesson. Gotta say that.
Now, is there anything else that can corroborate this historical trail? Well, thank you for asking, because there's a whole pattern of pollen all over the shroud, and pollen can determine where the shroud has been in its long history.
No, Russ. It cannot determine where the shroud has been. Again, Russ, you were just talking about how contaminated the shroud was and how they couldn't use the corners because they were so contaminated. And do you not think that so many people touching this shroud would have also brought pollen contamination? I mean, crazy idea, I know, but
In fact, Dr. Avinoam Danin, he's a leading botanist with the Hebrew University, written 7 books on the flowers of the Holy Land. His last and final book before he passed away is called Botany of the Shroud. This is what he said: using my database of more than 90,000 plant locations, the place that best fits the assemblage of the plant species whose images and often pollen grains have been identified on the shroud is 10 to 20 kilometers east and west of Jerusalem. That's pretty specific.
like I said, so much contamination. There is no way to determine such an exact location, especially considering the fact that the textile itself was not common in first century Judea. We seem to have not done research on that at all, actually. The pollen could have come from migrants coming to see the shroud, or maybe from moving the cloth around so much. I mean, there's so many different ways that pollen could have gotten on the textile. Contamination for centuries, you know. It does not determine that the cloth originated in first century Judea. You can't make these claims based on pollen alone, even though it sounds really cool and really impressive. Logically speaking, it doesn't work. It doesn't hold up.
So they scanned the shroud with X-radiography and spectroscopy, and they found these little tiny particles of limestone all over the shroud. But it's not just any kind of limestone. It's called travertine aragonite limestone. It's the same kind of limestone common to the hills and tombs around Jerusalem. And so then they also found particles of calcite. Now, calcite is the common ingredient in road dirt, but it's an oxidized form of limestone. But they found this calcite at only 3 locations: on the nose, on the knees, and on the feet. And so, what would you expect from someone who walked in sandals and fell under the weight of the cross?
As his presentation went on, I just felt these claims getting more and more ridiculous. There's no way to prove that someone was carrying the cross and then wrapped in the shroud. That's a crazy jump for me. This is so overreaching. Okay, let's just put this into perspective, okay? Calcite, limestone, and travertine are found all over Europe and the Middle East. All over. This is not somehow unique to Jerusalem, as he wants you to believe. And again, contamination. The shroud has been touched, kissed, carried, repaired, exposed to the elements, on display for centuries. That contamination alone essentially destroys any analysis of pollen and dust on the shroud because of the amount of contamination. And again, the location for that dust, it doesn't seem out of the ordinary for me. I mean, walking was the norm back then. Of course, you're going to find dust on the feet. Of course, you're going to find dust on the knees. You know, you probably squat down, kneel somewhere. This isn't out there for me. I don't know. You might touch the ground and then touch your face a bit, scratch your nose from the pollen and the dust out there. This would not be exclusive to somebody falling down under the weight of the cross. That is just leaping to a conclusion that doesn't even fit. Literally anyone could have dust in those 3 locations just from being outside so much, just from walking, just from existing. On top of that, the researcher who did this, Max Fry, I forget how to pronounce it, but he has been heavily criticized for his work. So just throwing that out there.
Well, let's get cynical for a minute.
Why couldn't we have been cynical for much longer than a minute? I think this presentation would have been a lot shorter if we had been cynical more.
Because, thousands of people were crucified. How do you know it's Jesus?
Yeah, how do you know?
Well, as I said at the very start, we don't have the DNA of Jesus to extract it and compare with anything we can find on the shroud. So it would be, I think, at least constructive then to at least compare the shroud with the gospel and see how well they line up or don't line.
I was hoping that we would compare it to something else, some other historical document, not just the Gospels, because we already did that, right? We already did that. And of course it lined up somewhat. because, the person who created the shroud probably referenced the Gospels to make it. But Russ then goes on for a very long time describing the injuries, the scourge marks on the body, the blood from the crown of thorns, the process of crucifixion, etc. And he went into all of those details, saying that it perfectly aligned with the Bible.
Everything about the shroud wound-wise is perfectly consistent with the gospel.
Yeah, duh. This guy is completely missing the fact that the relics in the medieval ages brought so much money to the churches. I mean, like massive funds. So if you're going to make a replica of the shroud that Jesus was supposedly wrapped in at his burial, of course you're going to want it to align with the Bible, because that's the research that people had and that's the stories that people knew and heard about. So of course you're going to want it to line up. It's literally the only place that we get details about the crucifixion of Jesus. It's the only place we have the details that he was stabbed in the side and everything. So of course the artist or the creator of the shroud would make them line up. That makes sense. My question when looking at the shroud is actually, why are the wounds so perfect looking? Like, imagine a man who was brutally tortured and killed. I would expect the whole thing covered in wounds, the whole thing covered in blood. I would not expect to see a perfect face where you can see the nose, the cheeks, the hair. I would expect to see a face completely beat up, perhaps not clear features. That's what I would expect. And I mean, even if you've watched a movie like The Passion of the Christ and you see Jesus' face, like, it is messed up. That's what I would expect if this was actually a man who was tortured and crucified. I would not expect this perfect recreation with wound marks in the exact right places. It seems sus to me. It is too perfect for me to believe that it was actually a crucifixion victim.
Now, this is an Egyptian burial tunic. There's about 75 of these in the Museum of Cairo. They all date to about the 2nd century. And the common denominator of these burial tunics are large swirling stains of decomposition with the body decomposed through the cloth over the years. There are no stains of decomposition on the Shroud of Turin. So if there was a body in that cloth, it wasn't in there for very long. So what caused the image then? Is it the work of an artist? I'd like to meet him.
Yeah. You, me, and a bunch of other historians and artists.
Custom crucifixion, maybe. Maybe someone deliberately crucified someone during the Middle Ages to emulate and replicate what happened to Jesus.
Yeah, crucifixion wasn't practiced in medieval Europe, so that's highly unlikely. But I like the way you're thinking, Russ. We're thinking about other options. Good job.
Maybe, but as far as we know, corpses don't make images on linen shrouds. At best, they make smudges.
Yeah.
What about resurrection then? I mean, after all, if this is the burial shroud of Jesus, then we know something pretty spectacular happened on the 3rd day.
How do we go from something logical, like an artist using a body double to replicate what happened to Jesus, to a fucking resurrection? We were on the right track. We were thinking logically. We had 2 reasonable guesses, even though one was historically improbable. But a resurrection, jumping from somewhat logical to boom, the miraculous, to the supernatural, to a phenomenon to have never been recorded, to have been proven. And we're doing all of this leaping only to explain art processes that are still unknown to us. This is a massive argument from ignorance.
And so if you're going to ask the question of what happened to Jesus, you're going to have to answer it with other verses of Scripture.
Scripture is not the only source, Russ. We've been over this. Scripture is not the only source, nor is it a highly reliable one, because it is filled with theological narratives.
So here's one right here, talking about the angel. His appearance was like lightning, and his clothes were white as snow, brilliant, brilliant being of light. And then how is Jesus? He's described on an incident called the Mount of Transfiguration. This occurred about 6 months before Jesus was even crucified. And the story goes that Peter, James, and John are at the bottom of the hill.
Russ, what happened to CSI Jerusalem? What happened? We are using the miraculous events described in the Gospels as evidence somehow for another miraculous event? Like, Is Thor real now? Is Thanos real because a comic book that has Thor in it says that Thanos is real, so both are real? Like, that's what we're essentially doing. This is the level of evidence that we're relying on now. We are using the same theologically and mythologically imbued gospels that talk about Jesus to also prove that Jesus resurrected. And I have to point out again that these gospels were written by people who did not even know Jesus decades after the fact and who had a goal to make converts. The gospels are not 100% historically reliable in that sense. We have to take everything they say critically and look at it critically to see if it is probable or not. We just can't take everything at face value because the authors had a purpose, they had a goal behind what they wanted to write, and it is theological. We have to consider that when reading the Gospels. We can't just say, well, transfiguration is in the Gospel, so it happened, it had light. Now, when Jesus resurrected, it also had light. Like, that's not evidence, guys.
And then how does he appear to Saul, who's rounding up these renegade Jewish believers in Jesus, putting them in jail? This is on the road to Damascus, and it says this: suddenly a light from heaven flashed around him.
Again, relying on miraculous events to prove other miraculous events. And also, this conversion story of Paul isn't even what he himself described. Paul did not describe his conversion experience like this, and even if he did, a vision is not evidence. If visions are evidence, then all religions are true. The rest of the presentation got very preachy, so I am not going to subject you to that. But I do want to share some of the ending with you because, yeah, it was out there, guys. And I just want to highlight that this was not at all a CSI Jerusalem. That was not ever the goal here. The goal here was a ploy to keep Christians thinking that their religion is true in an increasingly scientific age that brings forward evidence that it's not.
At the end of the day, I don't know if the shroud's authentic or not. I certainly can't possibly wrap my head around it being the work of a medieval artist. But here's what I know for sure. I know absolutely for sure that the message of the shroud is identical to the gospel. There is no difference.
Oh my gosh. The message of the shroud, as if the shroud had a message. If the shroud did have a message, the message was that it was meant to bring in more money for the church, as relics in medieval times did. That was the message. That was the goal. That was the point. Money, most likely. That is my conclusion based on the evidence. It might not have been, but.
And that message is very specific. It's past, present, and future. It's past because it brings us back to a historical event.
Sorry, I have to stop. The three points is just so common in evangelical churches. You always have a list of 3 things to remember. 3 things. And here the message is 3 things: the past, present, and future. It's just, it's a sermon.
And it's called the literal, physical resurrection of Jesus of Nazareth from the dead. It's not a myth. It's not a fable. It's not a fairy tale. It is a historical event that occurred in time. And you don't need the shroud. You have the testimony of all the apostles who died as martyrs for that same exact testimony.
This is so not the point right now, but I just have to call this out. There is absolutely no contemporary evidence that all of the apostles died as martyrs, let alone for resurrection beliefs. That evidence doesn't exist, and even apologists have admitted that. There is precious little to support this idea, and it mostly stems from much later myths. And on top of that, martyrdom and testimony and dying for beliefs aren't evidence that an event like a miraculous resurrection is true. That's not evidence. Again, if that were the case, then all beliefs are equally true because people have convictions and die for them. That would make all religions true. And it doesn't. That's not evidence. Come on, Russ. I think you need a dictionary of what evidence is.
A transaction has occurred. A payment has been made on our behalf. So I got to thinking about this. You know, when you go to a store and you purchase anything, you give the money to the cashier. What does he or she always give you in return? Exactly, a receipt. And what is a receipt? A receipt is a record of the transaction. It's a proof of purchase. Everything that was paid to purchase our salvation is on the receipt, making it an itemized receipt, documenting everything that was paid. So what does it mean? It means this, that we have been purchased. We belong to Christ. We have a receipt stamped in blood. This is paid in full.
He is saying that the Shroud of Turin is a literal receipt from God because he purchased us with his death. Oh my gosh. In the presentation, I could barely keep it together. I was like, this is crazy. I mean, kudos for you for coming up with this idea that I totally would have bought as a Christian. But oh man, my husband and I got a good laugh out of this afterwards. Like, a receipt. A receipt. The shroud is a receipt. Receipts are detailed, accurate, dated. I have a receipt right here, and you know what it says? Actually, where is it? Right here. Has a date, April 6, 2026 at 10:40 a.m. Time specific and everything. It has an itemized list of everything you bought with details. Does the Shroud of Turin have this? Like, God, Almighty God, where's the date on the Shroud of Turin? Because people can't seem to get that right. So if this is your actual receipt, could you, I don't know, put a date on it? Because, Aldi can put a date on their receipts, but you, the Almighty God, can't put a date on it? Like, come on. Also, this is pretty detailed here. God, where are the details that align with your Gospels? Like, the strips of linen on the wrist, the chin, the angles that is in the book of John. Where are those details in the Shroud of Turin? Or what about the face? Why is the face not brutalized? I thought this was a incredibly torturous event that Jesus endured for us. He looks pretty serene there. I mean, where's the trauma that he went through? Why does it not actually look like a crucified victim? Also, why would you let your literal receipt of salvation be nearly destroyed in a fire, in water, and by centuries of exposure? Why would you allow that if this was your literal receipt of salvation? Why would you let your literal receipt of salvation be used to bring in money for a church when that is something that Jesus literally flipped tables over? Like, I have so many questions. If you're going to use this analogy, I mean, yeah, I have so many questions. Like, guys, this receipt that I have here is more detailed than an alleged all-powerful God made his alleged receipt for us. Yeah, again, that explanation, I would have eaten that up as a Christian, but man, is it over the top. Anyways, I hope you guys enjoyed my incredibly long rant about the Shroud of Turin. I'd love to hear what you guys think about this, and so please leave your questions and comments down below. This is a topic that I'm extremely interested in. I have to say I'm not a historian, so all of my research is, surface level. I have not studied this in depth, but I'm very interested in it. So if you guys have more resources or more insights into things like textile history and everything, love to hear that. So please leave your thoughts and comments down below. Make sure to hit that like and subscribe button so you know when I release my next video. And until then, question everything.